Welcome back, dear viewers. Today we are traveling to Rome in the 1400s.
Close your eyes for a moment, and when you open them again, we will be standing in the middle of the old city.
Around the year 1400, the city of Rome had only 25,000 people living in it. Now, to understand how crazy that number is, you need to know something. 1,000 years before that, the same city had over 1 million people. That means 97% of the population had vanished. The greatest city in human history was now almost empty. Ancient temples were turning to dust. Wild animals walked through the streets at night near St. Peter's itself. Thieves ran entire neighborhoods. Garbage covered the old Roman roads. And here is the part that no one talks about. People still lived here. Families still woke up every morning inside these ruins. They still fed their children. They still went to work. They still prayed. But what did their lives actually look like? What did they eat? Where did they sleep? How did they survive when everything around them was getting destroyed slowly? The answer is something that history has almost completely ignored, until now.
The year is 1420, and something has just changed in Rome.
Pope Martin V has entered the city and brought the papacy back after decades in France. Now, this single event would slowly reshape everything about this city. But that is not what this story is about. This story is about the people who were already here before the Pope showed up. The ones who never left. Now, Rome in the 1400s was nothing like Florence or Venice. Those cities had banks and trade networks and wealthy merchant families. Rome had none of that. Rome survived because of one thing only, and that was the Catholic Church. The Pope was not just a spiritual leader. He ran the government. He controlled the courts. He was the largest employer in the city. Almost every job that existed in Rome was tied to the church in some way. And here is what made it even stranger. The city itself was mostly empty. People lived in less than 1/4 of the land inside the old walls. Most of them gathered near St. Peter's and in the low areas of Campus Martius and Trastevere. The rest of the space inside those ancient walls had nobody living in it. Vineyards grew where Roman senators once walked. Sheep grazed near old temples. Gardens covered what used to be public gathering places. Now here is where things get interesting. Because inside this broken and half-empty city, ordinary people were living lives that were far more complex and far more difficult than anything you have been told about the Renaissance. And over the next few minutes, you are going to see exactly what those lives looked like. Starting with the city they woke up in every single morning.
If you could step into Rome in the early 1400s, you would not believe what you were seeing.
The great buildings of the ancient world were still there, but they were damaged beyond repair. Columns had fallen and nobody had picked them up. Roofs had caved in decades ago. The Colosseum was being used as a source of free building stone. People pulled marble from ancient buildings and burned it in kilns to make lime. So the history of Rome was being destroyed piece by piece, just so families could patch their walls and build simple homes. But that is not even the strangest part. The streets were narrow and dark, and they had no proper drainage. When it rained, the roads turned into rivers of water mixed with waste from homes and animals. Pigs and chickens shared the streets with people. And the smell in the warmer months would have been very strong and really hard to live with. Now remember, this was the city that had once built the most advanced sewer system in the ancient world. But by the 1400s, almost none of that system was working anymore. So what about the homes people lived in? They were very basic. Most ordinary people lived in small structures made of wood and stone. These homes were dark and cold. There was no running water inside. There were no bathrooms. Now wealthier families lived in tower houses, which were tall, narrow buildings designed to be safe against crime. And many of these tower houses still stand in Rome today. And huge parts of the city had nobody living in them at all. Ancient ruins stood surrounded by open fields. Farmers planted crops between fallen columns. The whole place looked more like a scattered village among ruins than a real city. Now then, something started to change. but it came with a cost that most people do not talk about. When Pope Nicholas V came to power in 1447, he began spending money on rebuilding. He founded the Vatican Library. He hired builders and scholars. Later, Pope Sixtus IV went even further. He widened streets. He tore down old structures to make room for new ones. He ordered the building of the Sistine Chapel. But here is what they do not tell you in the history books. The ancient buildings of Rome were destroyed even faster during this period. Their stone and marble were taken and used for new churches and palaces. So the very thing that made Rome special was being torn apart to build something else. And for the ordinary person living through all of this, it did not feel like progress. It felt like noise and dust, and their homes being threatened. The city was changing, but nobody asked the people at the bottom if they wanted that change. And that brings us to something even more personal. Because no matter what was happening to the buildings around them, these people still had to eat.
So what did people in 1400s Rome actually eat?
Well, most meals started with bread, thick dark bread made from wheat or sometimes cheaper grains. With that bread, people ate pottage, which was a heavy stew made from whatever vegetables and beans they could get that season. Onions and garlic and lentils and cabbage were the most common things in the pot. Now meat was not something ordinary families ate every day. When they could afford it, they had salted pork or sometimes chicken, and cheese made from sheep or goat milk was around, and most families could afford small amounts of it. Now here is something that might surprise you. There were no tomatoes in 1400s Rome, no potatoes, no corn. Those foods came from the Americas and would not reach Europe until after 1492. So the Italian food you picture in your head did not exist yet. There was no red sauce. Pasta was only just beginning to show up in Italian cooking, and it was not a daily meal for anyone. And people drank wine with almost every meal, not because they enjoyed it as something special, but because the water in Rome was often unsafe to drink. The ancient aqueducts that once brought clean water into the city were mostly broken or blocked. Wells and fountains existed, but the water coming out of them was often dirty. So watered down wine was the safer choice for adults and even for children in many homes. Now, the markets of Rome were where all the food action happened. Vendors sold fresh bread baked that morning. Fish sellers brought catches from the Tiber River and the coast. Butchers displayed cuts of pork and lamb. Farmers from the land around Rome brought seasonal fruits and vegetables into the city. And for those who had the money, spice merchants offered pepper and saffron and cinnamon. There were also small eating places scattered through the city. Osterie were simple inns where travelers and locals could sit down for a basic meal with local wine. Frechette were wine shops. These were the places where working people gathered after a long day. A man finishing his work might stop for a cup of wine and a talk before heading home. And one of the oldest places like this started in Bologna in 1465, and it still works today in almost the same way it did over 500 years ago. But food was not just about filling your stomach. Every religious holiday had its own food traditions. Families made special dishes for weddings and funerals. When a baby was born, neighbors brought sweet and healthy food to the new mother. Easter brought large shared feasts. Food was how people marked the biggest moments of their lives. And then there was the other side of things. While ordinary families ate bread and stew, the papal court held feasts with dozens of courses. Roasted peacock served in its own feathers, pheasant covered in gold leaf, pies filled with organ meat, sugar shapes made to look like the papal crest. The gap between what a working family ate and what was served at a papal table was huge. And this was all happening inside the same small city. But none of those feasts would have been possible without the workers who kept Rome going every single day. And that is exactly what we need to talk about next.
So how did people in 1400s Rome make a living?
Well, if you had any kind of skill, you had to join a guild. Now, what was a guild exactly? It was a group that decided who was allowed to do a certain job and how that job should be done. Guilds set quality rules. They decided how long you had to train before you could work on your own. and they kept outsiders from coming in and taking work. So if you were a baker or a stonemason or a weaver and you wanted to work in Rome, you had to be part of a guild. There was no way around it. Now the guild system had 3 levels. At the bottom was the apprentice. This was usually a boy around 12 or 13 who was sent to live with a master craftsman. He would spend years doing the hardest and simplest tasks while learning the trade. Above him was the journeyman, and that was someone who had finished his training but did not yet own his own workshop, so he worked for daily pay instead. And at the top was the master craftsman who owned his shop and gave work to others. But here is something most people do not know about guilds. They were not just about work, they were whole communities. Guilds put together celebrations on religious feast days. They collected money to support the families of members who died. They paid for burials. They supported religious brotherhoods. So in a city with no government help, the guild was the closest thing to a safety net that ordinary people had. Now Rome did not make money the same way other Italian cities did. Florence made silk and wool. Venice traded with the East. Rome made very little of anything. Its economy was built almost entirely around serving the church. Innkeepers housed the thousands of pilgrims who visited every year. Bakers and butchers fed them. Guides showed them the holy sites. Candlemakers supplied the churches. Almost everything came back to the church. And the biggest source of work in the city was building. When the popes began their huge rebuilding programs, they needed hundreds of workers. Stonemasons came from across Italy looking for wages. Carpenters and plasterers and painters found steady work. And for ordinary men in Rome, the rebuilding was not about art or culture. It was about earning enough to feed their families. That is all it was. Now, women were officially kept out of most guilds, but they worked anyway. Many women ran family shops alongside their husbands. Others worked as laundresses and seamstresses and midwives. Some sold food in the markets. Their work kept the city going, but it was almost never written down and rarely given any credit. And over time, the guilds became harder and harder to get into. Wealthy families took control of guild leadership. Entry fees went up. The path from apprentice to master became nearly impossible for anyone who did not have money or the right connections. So the system that had once helped working people slowly became a system that kept them from growing. And yet even with all these problems, people kept working and kept building families. Which brings us to the most personal and most difficult part of life in 1400s Rome.
Family was the center of everything in 1400s Rome.
But here is the thing you need to understand. Family life was shaped by one truth that never went away. Death was always close. Now marriage was not about love, not the way we think about it today. It was a deal between families based on property and social position. Even among ordinary people, parents set up matches for their children. Girls were often married in their early to mid-teens to men who were 10 or 15 years older than them. And once a young woman got married, she left her family home and moved into her husband's house, where she was expected to handle everything inside. Now here is where the story gets hard. Giving birth was the most dangerous thing a woman went through in her entire life. Many women died during delivery or shortly after from infections that nobody knew how to treat. And the most important person in the room during birth was not a doctor, it was the midwife. She was usually an older woman from a similar background who had given birth herself many times and learned her skills from a midwife before her. Doctors respected what she knew. She was the person families trusted the most during the most serious moment they would ever face. And children who survived birth still faced danger after that. Babies dying young was very common. Many children did not live past the age of 5. Sickness and poor food were the main reasons. Families expected to lose at least one child, and sometimes more. And some historians believe that parents held back their feelings toward very young children because the chance of losing them was just so high. Now children who did survive were expected to start helping early. Boys might begin working alongside their fathers by age 10, or be sent to a guild as apprentices by 12. Girls helped their mothers with housework and learned the skills they would need to run their own homes after marriage. And adults died young too. A man who married in his late 20s might not live past his 40s. Women faced the danger of dying in childbirth throughout their whole lives. Because of this, many people married more than once. So a home might have children from 2 or 3 different marriages all living together under one roof. Now, most ordinary people did not have big families with lots of relatives. Knowing distant cousins and keeping wide family ties was something only the rich could manage. For most, Romans' family meant parents and their surviving children, and maybe one grandparent. The family was small because life was short and hard. But even facing all this loss, people found meaning in the one thing that promised something beyond death, and that was their faith.
Religion was not something separate from daily life in 1400s Rome.
It was part of every single thing people did from morning to night. Church bells rang throughout the day, and they did not just call people to prayer. They told people when to wake up, and when to eat, and when to stop working. Time itself was kept by the church. There were no clocks in ordinary homes, so people planned their whole day around the sound of those bells. People went to Mass regularly. They prayed at home before meals and before sleep. Religious pictures and carvings filled their walls. Small shrines to saints sat in corners of their rooms. And the presence of God was not something they thought about once a week. It was with them all the time. Now the church also had power over the law. It decided who could marry and under what rules. It told people what they could eat and when they could eat it. During Lent and other fasting times, meat was not allowed on certain days. These rules applied to everyone, and breaking them was treated as a serious matter. And here is something that shows just how much the church shaped how money moved through the whole city. Once every 25 years, the Pope declared a Jubilee year. During a Jubilee, pilgrims could travel to Rome and receive a full pardon for their sins. And in some Jubilee years, more than 100,000 pilgrims came into a city that normally held only 25,000 to 30,000 people. Now think about what that means. The number of people in the city grew 3 or 4 times over in just a few weeks. For ordinary Romans, this was the biggest money event of their entire lifetime. Every room in the city was rented out. Every baker worked all day and night. Every inn was full. People offered their services as guides to the holy sites. Street sellers sold food and religious items to the crowds. And a single Jubilee year could bring a family enough money to live on for years after that. Now, outside of Jubilee years, religion still gave people the only breaks from hard work. Saints' feast days were spread across the calendar. On these days, there were walks through the streets with banners and singing. People gathered for shared meals. Children played in the open squares. And for working families, these feast days were the only rest they got all year. And these religious groups did something else that really mattered. They kept people alive. They were made up of ordinary men and women who came together for charity and support. They cared for the sick. They collected money to help the poorest families. They arranged proper burials for those who could not pay. In a city with no hospitals and no government help, these groups were often the only thing between a poor family and losing everything. But even faith could not protect people from the one thing that scared everyone in the city. And that is what we're going to talk about now.
The most feared thing in 1400s Rome was plague.
The Black Death had hit Italy in the late 1340s and killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population in many areas. Rome's population had dropped below 20,000 after the worst outbreaks. And by the 1400s, the plague was not gone. It kept coming back every few decades, and each time it returned, it killed thousands of people. Now, nobody understood what caused it. People could not see germs. Most believed the plague came from bad air, or that God was punishing them for their sins. Doctors wore long robes and masks stuffed with herbs because they believed the smell would keep them safe. But none of that made any difference at all. So what did leaders actually do when the plague showed up? They tried to keep the sick away from everyone else. When cases appeared, they separated the sick from the healthy. The time apart started at about 14 days and was later stretched to 40 days. And this is where the word quarantine comes from. It comes from the Italian word for 40. By the 1400s, many Italian cities had set up official plague boards, and these were groups of officials whose job was to enforce health rules during outbreaks. But here is the part that makes things even worse. Even when there was no plague around, the daily health situation in Rome was terrible. The old sewer system that used to carry waste out of the city had mostly stopped working. The aqueducts that once brought clean water were broken or blocked. Streets served as open drains. People threw house waste from their windows right onto the road below. And rats and bugs were everywhere. Now clean water was hard to find. Wells and fountains existed, but they were often dirty and not safe to drink from. And this is the real reason people drank wine instead of water. It was simply safer for them and their families. And there was not much medical help you could get either. Barber surgeons handled basic work like pulling teeth and draining infected wounds. Apothecaries sold plant-based remedies. But most treatments were based on old habits mixed with beliefs about the body that had no real truth behind them. So if you got seriously sick, whether you lived or died had far more to do with luck than with anything a doctor could do for you. Now, how clean you could keep yourself depended on how much money you had. Richer Romans bathed more often and sometimes used scented water and herbs. Poorer people washed when they could with plain water. And public bathhouses, which had been a big part of life in ancient Rome, barely existed anymore in the 1400s. And then there was malaria. The wet and swampy land around Rome was perfect for mosquitoes that carried the disease. Every summer, malaria spread through the city. Those who had enough money left Rome during the hottest months and stayed in the countryside until the danger passed. Those who could not afford to leave stayed behind, and many of them got sick, and some of them did not make it through. Now, most people did not live past their 40s. Between plague and malaria and infections from even small cuts, death was a regular part of life in every home. Funeral walks were common on the streets of Rome. The religious groups arranged burials for families who could not pay for them on their own. And death was not something people hid from or talked about in quiet voices. It was out in the open, and everyone accepted it as a normal part of living in this city. Now, you might think that a city dealing with all this suffering would just keep getting worse. You might think that a place this broken and this sick would have nothing left to give. But that is not what happened. Because right in the middle of all this pain, something started to change, and the people who lived through it had no idea how big that change would become.
By the middle of the 1400s, something was shifting in Rome.
The city was still poor. The streets were still dirty. Ordinary people were still living in tough situations. But a new kind of energy was coming into the city, and it was starting to change things in ways that nobody expected. Pope Nicholas V brought scholars and thinkers to Rome from other parts of Italy. He built the Vatican Library and filled it with ancient texts collected from across Europe. He believed that studying the knowledge of the past could make the present better. And this was the start of a new way of thinking that later generations would call humanism. The idea that people had value and ability beyond simply serving the church. The idea that learning and beauty and reason mattered in their own right. Now, for ordinary Romans, this meant something very real and very simple. It meant jobs. When popes spent money on new buildings and art projects, they needed workers. Stonemasons and carpenters and haulers found steady pay. When artists came to Rome, they brought helpers and trainees with them. Workshops opened up. Someone had to prepare materials. Someone had to move heavy stone. Someone had to cook meals for the work crews. So the arrival of all these artists and thinkers did not just change the look of Rome. It changed how ordinary people earned their living. And then the printing press showed up in Italy around the middle of the century, and it changed everything about how people got information. Before the press, every book had to be copied by hand, which made books rare and costly. Now they could be made faster and for less money. Things that had been locked inside monasteries and rich homes began to reach people who had never had a chance to read them before. So for the first time, ordinary people who could read had a way to learn things that had never been shared with them. Now, artists came to Rome because the popes were willing to pay for their work, and because the ancient ruins offered something no other city had. The remains of the Roman Empire were not just broken stone. They were learning tools. Builders studied how the Romans put together arches and domes. Sculptors looked at ancient statues to learn how to carve the human body. So the ruins that ordinary Romans had lived among for generations suddenly had a new kind of worth that nobody had seen before. And by the 1470s and 1480s, Rome looked different. Streets were wider. New churches stood where ruins had been. The Sistine Chapel was being built. The population was growing again. For the first time in more than 100 years, the city felt like it was moving forward. But there is a part of this story that rarely gets told. The change in Rome came at a direct cost to the people living there. Neighborhoods were torn apart to make room for new projects. Homes were knocked down. Building materials that ordinary people had used for generations were taken by the church. So the rebirth of Rome was real, but the hardest part of that change was carried by those who had the least. Still, something had changed. The children born in the 1460s and 1470s grew up in a city that was different from the one their grandparents had known. They grew up watching buildings go up and new faces arrive and streets being laid out in new ways. They did not have a name for what was happening around them. They just knew that their city was no longer the same as it used to be, and they were part of it whether anyone remembered them or not.
That was Rome in the 1400s, a city caught between ruin and rebirth.
How did you like it? Many thanks for watching. Feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more time travels.